Hello, my name is Jared Ludlow, Publications Director at the BYU Religious Studies Center, your weekly resource for gospel scholarship. And today we'll talk about some resources related to the Come Follow Me reading for June 6th through 12th, the book of Ruth, and the first chapters of 1 Samuel. The first article is called The Lord Bringeth Low and Lifteth Up, Hannah, Eli, and the Temple. It's by Julie Smith, an independent scholar, and it comes from a Sperry presentation. This is an excellent overview of the characters and the story told at the beginning of 1 Samuel. It particularly pulls out a lot of great literary elements and tries to deepen our understanding of these characters and what happens in the story beyond just the basic storyline of a barren woman who then is blessed with a son. And so throughout this article, Julie does a great job of pointing out some of the deeper meanings and purposes of the narrative and shows how Hannah moves from the periphery as a barren woman to really the central part of the story and emphasizing the importance of the tabernacle and of covenants. In fact, Hannah becomes a model of keeping covenants and of not reacting poorly when others are mistreating her or misjudging her. She also points out an interesting chiasmus of the narrative story that goes from Hannah's barrenness at the beginning to having a son at the end, but then some conflicts in between, and of course with the Lord blessing her for her covenant faithfulness. And I think one of the important points she brings out is how Eli, you would expect to make the tabernacle and the temple the central part of his service, but it's really Hannah that becomes the role model for how that should be done. And her actions not just impact herself and her family, but really impact the nation. Likewise, Eli's actions not only impact himself and his family, his sons particularly, in the negative path that they're on, but that also impacts the nation. So I highly recommend taking a look at this article and seeing the different aspects of the narrative story. The second article is called Ruth, Redemption, Covenant, and Christ. It's by Carrie Muhlstein, a member of the Ancient Scripture Department here at BYU, and also comes from a past Sperry presentation. And throughout this article, he points out how many elements in the story of Ruth serve as a type of Christ. In fact, one of the major points he makes is that it's not a coincidence that later the Redeemer, Jesus, will descend from this line of redemption, the redemption that's brought out in various aspects of the story. In order to bring some of these points out, he breaks down and shares some of the insights into the daily life of ancient Israel. He talks about some of the cultural elements that are brought out in the story and explains some of their meanings. And he makes a point that people are often the Lord's means for pouring forth his blessings. And we see this repeatedly through the interactions of Ruth to Naomi and Boaz to Ruth. The last article is called The Ceremony of the Shoe, a Ritual of God's Ancient Covenant People. It's by Alonzo Gaskill, member of the Religion Department at BYU, and comes from a volume called By Our Rites of Worship that looks at some Latter-day Saint ritual understandings. In this article, Alonzo looks at levirate marriage, this practice of a brother marrying a widow from another brother in order to raise up seed for his brother. And he looks particularly at Ruth chapter 4 and makes the case that it's not intended to be a representation of this traditional levirate marriage, as sometimes it is interpreted. Instead, he focuses on what he calls the ceremony of the shoe, which is found in other stories related to business transactions, particularly the transferal of property. And so he shows how this matches more the story of what's going on in Ruth chapter 4 rather than levirate marriage. He also talks a little bit about the symbolism of shoes in relation to holy places and taking off of shoes in order to enter those holy places. And so overall, he tries to show and help us understand a little bit more about this ancient custom